Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us in Reading Time with Pickle. We've been reading Asylum by Madeleine Roux for the last month or so. This is a young adult, I would classify it as a young adult supernatural / psychological / horror novel. It is about a boy by the name of Dan who goes to college prep school that his dormitory, I guess, where he's living is at an old asylum. I apologize, not the greatest rundown. I actually haven't opened this book in about 2 weeks. Overall, to me, I have a few issues with the book, which I've been complaining about in previous videos, so I'm just going to cut it short. Character development is poor. The pacing it's scripted. It's just plot 1 or incident 1 to incident 2 to incident 3. I guess script is really the best way that you can describe it. I was actually about to give up and start a different novel. It just didn't catch me. The characters were very shallow, including the main character, Dan. It's just not going anywhere, and the places that it goes, again, it's very scripted. So far, though, Dan's made 2 new friends, Abby and Jordan. They're very shallow, both of them, in my opinion. Abby's basically a hot girl, a hot artist girl. Really, there's not much more to her at this point, which is kind of disappointing. Jordan is a homosexual male, which is fine, but it's become very evident that his gender, at least to me, how I view his gender is that so there aren't 2 females. It's so Dan has 1 love interest, which is Abby, but so that it's not just the 2 of them. You need another friend. But at the same time, this other friend can't compete with either Abby, so it can't be another girl. And he can't compete with Dan for Abby. So he can't be into Abby. What's the best way to do that? Oh, let's make him gay. That's kind of what I get from Jordan, which is really disappointing because his dialogue is actually the most interesting. He has some really funny bits. Other than that, there really aren't that many other characters even introduced. There's Dan's roommate, I think Felix is his name, which he's kind of always on the periphery. I think there's a bit more with Felix. Overall, very underwhelming. I like novels with a lot of character development, given we're still, how far are we? We're still about 1/3 of the way into the novel. In chapter 13, so hopefully chapter 13 will be good. So far in the story, they've been building up to the history of, Brookline dorm. So we learned that it used to be an asylum, and oh, spooky, spooky, scary, scary, it was asylum for murderers. And there is one murderer. I feel bad, I'm quite ill-prepared. There is one murderer. I guess his name was Dennis. Let's see, let's take a look. Dennis whatever. He was a murderer, and Dan wants to learn more about him. They go into the basement. Dan, I guess, somehow finds his file. They get caught. Abby pretends to be sorry, and she cries to the hall monitor, and the hall monitor lets them go. Surprise, surprise. There's not much suspense, really. And I understand this is geared towards young adults, but at the same time, it's like, come on. In chapter 13, we know they're not going to get kicked out of school. And they get out because Abby starts fake crying, and the hall monitor feels bad for her and lets them go. Like, let's up the stakes a little bit. Um, anyways, I am one to complain, but I don't like to complain too much. Let's just dive right on in. Hopefully, we're about a third of the way through. Hopefully, the novel really starts to pick up the pace, really starts to amp up the suspense, the pressure, maybe a little bit of horror or even psychological terror thrown in. Right now, it's just like, oh, we're at summer camp. It's just me and my friends, literally so few other characters in the mix so far. Um, oh, and another plot point. Dan goes on a date with Abby, which is basically an excuse for exposition for Dan to talk about, oh, I got a freaky whatever on my email. It's just scripted. Anyways, I'm not one to give up. I wanted to move on to something else, but we're already a third of the way through. Let's just plow through. Hopefully in Act 2, where we're getting into Act 2, things will start to pick up. Chapter number 13. Dan was dead tired. As he started to climb the stairs, he couldn't believe it was only a little after 10. But his most pressing thought was not of sleep. With every step, he felt his energy surge. He had a card on the sculptor and a leather folder to go through. The closer he got to his room, the more wired he felt. Dan was relieved to find that Felix was still gone. He wanted to look at the stuff he'd taken in private. He pulled out the index card and the folder and put them on his desk. His fingers were repelled by them. The stench of the basement and his itch made him feel unclean, but he couldn't stop. He took a look at the index card first. Hameline Dennis, Elias the sculptor, born 1935. Date of arrival, May 15th, 1965. Reason for admittance, serial killer. Homicidal, yes. Recovered, yes. Yes? Dan was shocked by that last line. A serial killer recovered? How? How would they even know? Then something else caught his eye. On the bottom right corner of the card, 3 handwritten numbers, 361. Suddenly, Dan was clawing at his shoulders, trying to stop the itch. The card sat on the desk just as it was, but the 361 seemed to shimmer. Get a grip, Dan. He really had to calm down. Take a shower. But first, he took the card and the folder and hid them in the drawer, with the warden. Dan stood in the shower for a long time. Jung had this way of talking about coincidences, one that Dan had always liked. Basically, he said that when people saw a meaningful connection between two moments, a coincidence, the connection wasn't because one moment led to the other. It was because people's brains were always making connections. The sculptor was patient 361. His discovery couldn't be a coincidence, it was a connection. Dan fumbled with the towel and his clothes in his haste to get back to his room. He grabbed the folder and flipped through the sheets of paper inside. Invoices, employee evaluations. Dan gave everything a passing glance, but he didn't stop on anything until he came to a slip of folded paper. The sheet was torn, as if it had been yanked out of a journal or notebook. Dense cursive handwriting filled the page. He sat on his bed and began to read. Very nature of his ailments continue to baffle me and baffle us all. What is the source of this abnormality? Everywhere we observe plants, animals, systems with a core. Every flower has its seed. Every animal its heart. Every masterpiece its inspiration. Yet the answers I seek elude me. There's a root somewhere in his brain, a twisted root that sprouts madness and malice. I will find it. No matter the cost, no matter the difficulty, I will find it. I will live a truly great life. My colleagues will no doubt hang me metaphorically, but I say, let them hang. Legality, morality, sympathy aside, I will pull madness out by its black root, and I will leave a legacy no man, however sanctimonious, can fault. A truly great life. That is what humanity deserves. Not an average life, not even a normal one. A life in which genius is not an anomaly but an expectation. But to achieve such things. And there the page ended. Dan flipped it over, perfectly aware that it was blank on the other side, but wanting to know more. Much more. Without context, without a signature, the piece of paper wasn't much to go by. The writer of this page was clearly talking about curing someone who was insane, and he was talking about something unusual, some new treatment that he alone might discover. Dan's mind began to race. These weren't the musings of some random Brookline doctor. These had to be the ideas of its warden, and not just any warden, if he was to believe the conspiracy enthusiast Sal Weathers, the warden, the one who had changed Brookline's history and rehabilitated a serial killer. Rereading the journal page, Dan admired the warden's grand vision. This man was willing to try something revolutionary to cure insanity. He dared to be different, to challenge the status quo, even if he was rejected for it. Wasn't that a little of what Dan was like, scorning the popular opinion, the popular crowd, and aspiring to be something more? But this note wasn't just promoting intelligence, he thought. This was something a little more sinister. Genius is an expectation. Genius was nice and all, but you couldn't force it on people, could you? Besides, what kind of treatment could do something like that? What could put a yes, a Y, next to recovered? He leaned back on his pillow, trying to put the pieces together in his head. The horrible photograph of the patient struggling. This piece of paper by the warden about a madman. The emails about patient 361. The sculptor. It all seemed to be adding up. But to what? He leaned back on his pillow, trying to put the pieces together in his head. The horrible photograph of the patient struggling. This piece of paper by the warden about a madman. The emails about patient 361. The sculptor. It all seemed to be adding up. But to what? Dan grabbed his laptop. When he went back to Sal Weathers' website and clicked Contact Me, he was totally just looking for an email address. But good old Sal had listed his full details, and Dan was shocked to find an address that wasn't just in New Hampshire. It was in Camford. One of Professor Reyes's petitioners, I'll bet, Dan murmured. It now made sense that Sal Weathers would be so invested in cataloging and publishing Brookline's sordid history. He was probably hoping to get the place torn down. Part of him wished Sal lived across the country or in Cambodia so that the temptation to visit him wouldn't be so strong. But all signs were pointing to a meeting with this man, and Dan wasn't about to ignore a message from the universe. So, it's official, he whispered to the computer. I'm obsessed. He stood in a cell, waiting. Finally, a group of doctors came in, all wearing masks and gowns. Dan waited for them to hurt him, but they didn't seem to know that he was there. They stood around, talking and jotting notes on their pads. Then Dan heard screaming. 2 orderlies came into the room, dragging a girl between them. She was barely 10 years old, and her face was familiar, pale, frightened with big open eyes. Okay, fellas, let's get to work on her. At the sound of his own voice, Dan bolted awake. Even in his sleep, he couldn't escape. Chapter number 14. Usually, Abby beat him to the dining hall, but despite the late night and broken sleep, Dan saw no sign of her or Jordan as he got in line for breakfast. He heaped hash browns, eggs, and a few strips of bacon onto his plate and grabbed a bowl of cereal from the end of the buffet before heading to their usual spot, a circular table by the far window. When he finished eating his eggs and bacon, he watched the other students filing in, but Abby and Jordan still didn't come. He started in on his cereal, taking his time with it. As the minutes ticked by with no sign of his friends, he became increasingly aware of the fact that he was the only student eating alone. He was used to this at his high school, but here he felt conspicuous, naked without his friends. Finally, he spotted Jordan, who looked even worse than Dan felt, if that was possible. "Hey," Jordan said, sitting down with a whump. Big, nasty bags rimmed his eyes behind his glasses. "You all right? Looking a bit tired there." "I'm fine," Jordan snapped, sounding decidedly unfine. Dan glanced at the doors again. Abby would know how to make this better. "She'll show up when she shows up," Jordan says. "Can't you wait even a second to see her?" He bit into an English muffin as if it had personally insulted him. "What the hell? Are you okay, Jordan?" Dan risked, knowing Jordan might go for him again. "I'm fine. Jesus, what is this, the Inquisition? Are you on my dad's payroll now?" The English muffin was dying a painful death in Jordan's tightening grip. A piece broke off and landed in his bowl of Cap'n Crunch. Jordan fished it out with his chewed-up fingernails. They fell into an uneasy game of looking anywhere but each other. Given his options, get chewed out again or stare at his cereal, Dan chose the cereal. Could Jordan still be angry about last night? With 5 minutes until the dining hall closed, Abby finally made an appearance. She dashed to the fruit and granola line and grabbed a banana and a bowl of yogurt. Her usual sunny disposition was gone. Her eyes were half-lidded, and her pretty olive complexion was ashen. She sat down with a quick, "Hey," and started eating without another word. "Hey," Jordan said. "You come down with something? You look terrible." "What are you talking about?" Abby glared. "Nothing. I was just saying you look radiant. New makeup?" "Yeah, because sarcasm is exactly what I need right now." Dan tried to lighten the mood. Sounds like someone woke up on the wrong side of the gurney." He immediately wished he had kept his mouth shut. Abby looked at him, her eyes flashing in anger. She dropped her spoon in her bowl, splattering yogurt all over her tray. "Actually, Dan, there was something important I wanted to talk to you guys about, but I guess it will have to wait." With that, she grabbed her tray and left the table. "Congratulations," said Jordan. "That might be the briefest relationship in the history of the universe." Jordan finished his mangled muffin. "In fact, since you're not even technically a couple yet, it's sure to be one of those delightful death by silent treatment endings. Quel dommage." What the hell did I do to piss you guys off?" But Jordan was already on his way out, and Dan ended up saying it to the back of his head. Dan's mood worsened in class when the professor showed a documentary he had already seen, which meant he sat for 2 hours in the dark, distracted, not a word of the film penetrating his brain while he replayed breakfast in his head. Maybe it wasn't fair to expect Abby to be sunshine and daisies all the time. Everyone was allowed a bad day here and there. She might have gotten another disheartening text from her sister. Whatever the cause, Dan decided it was foolish to read too much into it. Abby would tell him what was wrong in her own time, and he would be there to listen when she did. He wouldn't let a bad breakfast spoil things between them. With that reasonable plan in mind, Dan felt his spirits lift on the walk back to Brookline. Neither Jordan nor Abby had said anything about lunch, so he figured he would try to fit in a bit of studying. Or, he thought, his nerves coming to jittery life, he could make good on his self-promise to visit Sal Weathers. He'd have more than enough time if he hurried. Felix was in when Dan got back to his room. He was, as always, at his computer. It looked like he was browsing a bodybuilding forum of all things, and Dan noticed that his roommate was sucking down something called Muscle Aid, which judging by the strapping oil dude on the bottle was some kind of prepackaged protein shake. Not Felix's usual diet, but then again, Dan had known the kid for a grand total of a week. Still, he thought Felix looked more buff than he had when they first arrived. His shoulders seemed broader somehow. Maybe protein shakes worked after all. "Hey," Dan said, going straight to his own desk. "Hello, Dan." Finishing his drink, Felix crushed the plastic bottle in his hand and threw it over his shoulder, and Dan watched, amazed as it landed squarely in the garbage can behind him. "Nice throw," said Dan, trying to cover his surprise. A crisp white envelope waited on Dan's keyboard. His heart beat a little faster. Was it from Abby? An apology or maybe an invitation to go somewhere and talk? "Did you see who brought this?" Dan asked, opening the envelope. "No, it was here when I came in. I assumed you put it there before you went to breakfast." "Shit, I must have forgotten to lock the door this morning," Dan said. It was a hard habit to get into. Still, he could swear that he locked things up that morning. "That's troubling," Felix replied, not taking his eyes from his computer screen. "Please don't let that happen again." "Sorry, man, I won't." Inside the envelope, Dan found a simple card made of thick paper. On it was just a single line of spidery handwriting, a single question. Question: how do you kill a hydra? That was distressing. Dan flipped the card over. You strike at its heart. Chapter number 15. What kind of sick joke was this? Dan looked at Felix, who hadn't turned around or moved a muscle. "Are you sure you didn't see who left this?" Dan said. "I'm sure. It's not signed?" "No, it's not signed." Dan flashed the card at Felix, but not long enough for him to be able to read it. Strange. Do you recognize the handwriting?" Felix continued browsing his current web page, the wheel on his mouse clicking softly as he spun it. "No, it's calligraphy or something. Nobody writes like this anymore." "Calligraphers do." "Do you know any calligraphers?" Dan snapped. At last, Felix turned around. He thought for a few seconds, then said calmly, "Not at this program, no. I do have a friend back at school, though, who's pretty good at it." "That doesn't help me." Sighing, Dan dropped into his chair and swiveled it around. "Sorry, bad day." "I understand, and I hope you find your mystery pen pal." Sinking deeper into his chair, Dan flipped the card over and over again, studying the handwriting and trying to find some clue in the words. Hydra. There were at least 50 kids at Professor Douglas's class who would have heard that clever nickname he had given the three of them yesterday. Dan had no way of pinning down the identity of the writer. What if Joe, the hall monitor who had caught them in the old wing, had placed the card on his desk? It actually made a weird kind of sense. Joe would want to keep them from snooping around again after hours, and the note was just creepy and threatening enough to make Dan think twice about a repeat of last night. Joe would also, as a hall monitor, have a master key to the rooms, which fit because Dan was positive he had locked the door that morning. The knot in Dan's stomach loosened. Thinking of Joe as the author of the note made the whole thing feel explicable, at the very least, and perhaps even a little bit funny. Ha ha, Joe, you got me good. But Dan wasn't entirely convinced. He decided he'd bring the card to dinner. If Jordan and Abby had received notes too, they might be able to figure it out together. Until then, Dan knew he definitely wouldn't be able to do any real studying. And if anything, the card only strengthened his determination to meet Sal Weathers. There wasn't enough time left in lunch break to make it down and back, so he decided to skip his next class. He threw his sweatshirt on again, pulled up Sal's address on his phone, grabbed his backpack, and then sped out the door. It felt good to get out of the dorm. Things had a way of feeling so heavy there. The weather seemed to be on his wavelength, overcast and chilly despite the fact that it was June. It looked like it might rain. Dan walked briskly, keeping his head down and following the path that led from the dorms back to the academic side and beyond. The paved path dipped, taking a wide curve down a hill. For all the hustle and bustle on campus, Camford always felt rather small and quiet. Today, the streets were practically empty. A lone pickup truck sped by as Dan made it down to the bottom of the hill. 3 blocks, 1 donut shop, and a car garage later, Dan was at his destination. He snuggled down deeper into his sweatshirt, staring up at the drive to a brick dormered house set back from the road. Pausing, he glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning above the tree line. From there, he could just make out the top of the old church steeple, and beyond that, Wilford Commons and Brookline's roof. He fished out a notebook and pen from his backpack, wondering how best to introduce himself. A simple wicker cross hung in the window of the front door. Dan knocked, suddenly hoarse with nerves, already thinking that it had been a mistake to come. Sure, Sal sounded talkative on his website, but would he be so effusive in person? Dan would have to express his own interests in a way that would get him the information he needed. He knocked again with more conviction. Finally, he heard a shuffling from inside. A spotted, craggy face appeared in the window behind the cross, and a second later the door flew open. The scent of cinnamon candles rushed out to meet him. "What are you selling?" "Selling? Oh, no, nothing. I'm from the college," Dan explained. He gestured clumsily over his shoulder to the hill. I was going to email you, but I'm sorry. I know this is sort of strange, but I found your webpage. The one about Brookline? I'm doing a project on it, and you seem like the local expert, so... Sal stared at him, clearly trying to decide if he was crazy or joking or both. "Come in," he finally muttered, disappearing into a dark mud room. A light came on, showing a shoe rack filled almost exclusively with work boots and ladies' slippers. "So you found my little report on the internet, huh? Good. That's good. More people ought to know, but I gotta tell you, kid, I don't much like talking about it. None of us do. I said my piece with that page on the internet, and now the only time I want to talk about it is to get that hell of a place torn down. Of course, some bitch up at the college won't stand for it, says it's historical." "I think you mean Professor Reyes," Dan said pointedly. "She's actually planning to run a seminar in the dorm, and then..." "A dorm? So they're housing you kids in it now, are they? That's a real laugh." Sal shuffled into the kitchen and Dan followed. He had a feeling he would be leaving with a blank notebook. "This is my wife," Sal was saying. "Don't mind us, honey. This young man's from the college, but he's not staying very long." The kitchen was cramped, furnished with cheap laminate cabinets and mauve tiles. Dan ducked his head shyly. "Hello," he greeted Sal's wife. She was gaunt, sunken, but Dan saw shadows of a pretty woman gone old and frail. Her thick hair was tied into a bun at her nape, and heavy fringe of bangs covered her forehead. She seemed to be staring at nothing, her hands propped lightly on the island countertop in the middle of the room. Sal puttered around the island until he found a coffee mug. He checked its contents and then took a big sip. When he glanced back up and saw Dan still standing there, a look of resignation crossed his face. He shuffled over until he was almost right in Dan's face and said in a voice barely above a whisper, "All right, kid, you get one question. What do you want to know so bad?" Dan hardly knew where to start. He tried to collect his thoughts into one single question. Finally, hoping that this one question would lead to many answers, he said, "I just wanted to know more about Dennis Hainline." Instantly, he knew he'd said something wrong. Sal flinched, and behind him, his wife stopped staring at whatever was so interesting over Dan's shoulder and looked right in his eyes. Dan blundered on. I was curious about the connection between the last warden and Dennis Hainline, the sculptor." "Did you say your name was?" Sal interrupted, slamming his mug down on the island. I didn't," Dan stammered, taking a step back. It's Dan. Dan Crawford." It was like a bomb had gone off. Suddenly, Sal's wife was screaming, throwing herself down on the island countertop, swinging her arms and sending Sal's mug and a stack of dishes crashing to the floor. Dan leapt back only to have Sal descend on him, his craggy old face red with blotches. What the hell kind of sick joke are you trying to pull? My wife is ill and you come in here like that? You damn college kids, always so smart, so clever, eh? Not so clever today. Get out. Get out. Dan hardly bothered to turn, backing out as fast as he could without getting tangled up in the shoe rack at the door. And the door. The woman shrieking followed him onto the stoop. When at the door, still shouting. Then Sal was at the door, still shouting, "Get the hell out!" As if Dan wasn't trying to do exactly that. He ran. He ran until he reached the hill and the path winding back up to the college. What had just happened? What had he said? How could Dennis Hainline be such a sore subject when Sal himself had written about the guy? When Dan reached his room, Felix was gone. A note on his dry erase board read simply, "Departed for gymnasium, 1600. Dan rolled his eyes, thinking, just another Felix quirk. He shrugged off his backpack and flung himself down on his bed. Miserable, he rolled onto his back and shoved the pillow over his face. Class skipped, and for what? He was no closer to figuring out the link between the warden, the sculptor, Brookline, and himself than he had been at the start of the day. And now he had the horrified face of Sal's wife to add to the list of things haunting him, and her screams. Dan groaned into the pillow. He had to let it go or he'd drive himself crazy over nothing. Sal was just a nutty old bat who hated the college and everything associated with Brookline. He probably grew up in Camford resenting the kids who could afford a higher education. Wasn't there even a label for that? The townies and the gownies? Wasn't his fault. Outside it had started raining. That would make getting to dinner a little less pleasant. But after the afternoon he just had, Dan was eager for friendly company. And it was already 5 minutes till 5, so there'd soon be people in the dining hall. He snatched up the hydronote and headed downstairs. As he passed the hallway leading down to the old wing, he felt a sudden temptation to go there and hide. But he pressed on to the main doors, shaking off the fear that was creeping down his back. Dan pulled the hood of his sweatshirt and ran through the downpour to the commons. He shook himself off when he reached the entrance, and then followed the line of students forming inside the cafeteria. Mac and cheese night. Could be worse. Dan grabbed a tray, his eyes roaming over half-familiar faces as he looked for his friends. He saw Yi come in and wave to a few guys on the other side of the room before getting in line right behind him. "How's it going?" Yi asked, drumming his fingers on his pastel blue tray. You know, the usual, studying classes, threatening notes, psychos. Yourself? So amazing. Yi pulled a slip of paper out of his cargo pants and handed it to Dan. Oh God, did Yi get a strange note too? But when he unfolded it, Dan saw it was only a printed out dating profile for someone with the screen name Chloe13. She liked skiing and Amelie. I'm studying abroad on a scholarship in the fall, conservatory in Paris. Dan handed the paper back and watched Yi smiling dreamily down at it. Just a few more months and I'll be swimming in hot foreign women. Dan coughed. Yeah, I could have phrased that better. Yi put Chloe13 back in his pocket. The line moved forward. How's things on the Abbey front? They sidled up to the buffet. Dan slopped macaroni onto his warm plate. How did you... Jordan mentioned a date or something. How'd it go? Surprisingly, Yi bypassed the mac and cheese and went for the vegan offering. Something with lentils and unidentifiable chunks of vegetable matters. Things with Abby are good, Dan managed to croak. Honestly, he didn't know what to think, considering how Abby had been this morning. And I guess it was a date. We just got dinner at Brewster's and hung out. It was a nice time. Dan dug the big metal ladle into the macaroni again, preparing to take another serving. Bullshit. You get any? Dan dropped the spoon and it clattered against the edge of the buffet. He caught it, but not before splattering himself with globs of cheese product. Crap, that's hot. He half-elbowed, half-bumped the spoon back into the tray and tried to brush the neon orange cheese off his forearm. Yi chuckled, moving away from the line. I'll take that as a no. Swearing, Dan grabbed a dinner roll from the pile and then walked over to their usual table. He dropped into the chair nearest the window, brooding over his steaming plate of food. His time with Abby last night felt private, not something to be discussed casually over the dinner line. Or maybe it was just that he didn't know how things stood, and he didn't want to jinx them by bragging. He rubbed at the splotchy red marks on his skin. They were still smarting. Hey, it was Abby. Her hair in a damp tangle, and her eyes were red. She set her tray on the table and sat down slowly, as if moving through water. Hey, Dan said, forgetting his burn. Can I sit? I am sitting already, but... She looked down into her soup, sighing. Do you mind? No, by all means, Dan said. I was hoping you'd turn up. Yeah? Smiling, Abby put her elbows onto the table. Thanks. I was pretty horrible at breakfast, but I have a good excuse. I promise. I wouldn't just be like that. It's okay if you were, he replied. We all have rotten days. He nodded to the window behind them, where the rain fell in noisy sheets against the glass. See, the weather's feeling like crap too. No, I like the rain. It's relaxing, refreshing. She gazed out the window. Puddles were forming in the low dips of the grass and along the pathways, and the mist was swirling so that the rain and fog couldn't be teased apart. I needed a bit of rain. Dan smiled. Already, she was making him feel better. He decided he'd wait for Jordan to get there before mentioning the note. So he and Abby more or less ate in comfortable silence until Jordan stumbled into the dining hall. After a quick breeze through the food line, he sat down with just a cup of piping hot coffee and a slice of Boston cream pie. He didn't even say hello. Rain and the steam from the coffee fogged his glasses. But Dan couldn't wait any longer. I got a note, he blurted, startling Abby and Jordan. He reached into his back pocket and took out the card, dropping it onto the table between them. Jordan picked it up. How do you kill a Hydra? What the hell? Turn it over. Jordan read the back, his face a mixture of confusion and distaste. What is this? Where did it come from? Jordan pushed the card away with a grimace, and Abby grabbed it. It was on my desk when I got back from class. Felix didn't see who left it, but someone managed to get into the room even though I'm sure I locked the doors. You guys didn't get anything like this? They both shook their heads. Dan was dismayed. He hadn't realized how much he was counting on this being a bad joke. Rubbing his temples, he said, I think it could be from Joe. I don't know who else would leave something like this or even be able to get into the room. But I was sure he'd have left them for you guys too. Dan pushed his macaroni into a feeling singled out. So what are you going to do? Abby asked, giving the card back to him. Dan shrugged. He knew it would be impossible to explain to anyone else why this bothered him so much. He wasn't even sure he fully understood it himself. Just ignore it, Jordan said. Joe's trying to rile you up, that's all. That's what bullies do, trust me, I know. It's better if you let it slide off your back. They were silent for a moment. Then Abby said, There's something else. Your note, it's important and all, but I wanted to tell you both something too. It's what I was going to bring up at breakfast before I got so, mad. She paused. I'm not quite sure how to say this, she said, twisting her hands around each other. So I'll just go for simple. Simple is probably best, if anything about this is simple. As she talked, Dan noticed that her entire demeanor changed. Her shoulders sagged and the light went out of her eyes. She took a deep breath. My aunt, my father's sister, she was a patient here. There was silence. Dan and Jordan looked at each other. How do you know? Asked Dan. Here, look what I found last night. Abby pulled an index card out from her raincoat. It was from the card catalog in the warden's office and looked just like the one for Dennis Hamelin. So Abby had taken something too. Hands shaken, Abby turned the card around so that both Jordan and Dan could read it. There were just 4 lines typed. Valdez, Lucy Abigail. Born July 15th, 1960. Date of arrival, February 12th, 1968. Recovered, no. Chapter number 16. For a moment, Dan didn't understand. The words didn't make any sense. Then they slowly came into focus. Lucy Abigail Valdez. Abby Valdez. It's a common enough last name, Dan said at last, stammering a little. Right? He looked into Abby's wide eyes. Right? She shook her head, pressing her lips tightly together. That's my aunt, Aunt Lucy. I was named after her. Come on, Abby, Jordan said. That's not your aunt. That's just not possible. Dan sat back, silent, waiting for a reasonable explanation, if one existed. I'm afraid it is possible. A gust of wind hit the windows, rattling the glass. The rain slapped down on the glass like a shower of pebbles. Abby looked out the window and then back again. She was clearly trying to keep from crying. My grandparents were really strict on my pops when he was growing up. His sister Lucy never got along with them. From the time she was a little girl. She never listened, she'd talk back, scream, break things, stuff like that. One day there was a huge fight. My pops doesn't know what it was about, he was only 5, but he remembers that Lucy ran out the door and slammed it behind her. That night, he woke from a nightmare and Lucy wasn't in her bed. 7 years old and she was gone. Just gone. My grandparents acted like everything was normal, and when my pops would ask, they'd get really angry and tell him he wasn't allowed to say her name anymore. Dan was at a loss. The story lined up, but what were the odds? Maybe it's just a coincidence, the name, he said, not really believing that himself. He just wanted so badly for it to be true. Coincidence is you and me both picking pie for dessert, Jordan said. He gestured to the patient card with his cup. What Abby is suggesting is flat out strange. What, you don't believe me? Abby said. Her voice sounded like she was kidding at first, waiting for Jordan to contradict her, but he didn't. That's it, isn't it? You don't believe me. Can you really blame me? I mean, what are the chances you just randomly wind up here for the summer at the place where your aunt used to be a mental patient? Jordan sat back, arms crossed. I think there's something you're not telling us, or you're just not telling us the truth. Dan could see Abby's shoulders beginning to shake as she tried and failed to control her breathing. It was too late to intervene, and he couldn't think of a damn thing to contribute anyway. Jordan had a point about how impossible the coincidence was, but Abby wasn't the sort to mess with them for kicks. Or was she? A little voice whispered in his mind. How well did he really know her after? Her mood in the last 24 hours had certainly been unpredictable. He stopped himself. She wouldn't make a joke out of something like this. She just wouldn't. Fine, Abby finally said, composing herself. I wasn't going to say anything, but I guess we're a little past this now. Dan shared a nervous glance with Jordan. Abby picked up her spoon and dragged it softly across her bowl as she began to speak. When I was little, I used to go through my mom's clothing looking for hats and skirts and scarves and stuff to play dress up. She and my pop shared dressers, and one time I found this box. She inhaled deeply, then pressed on. I don't know what it was, but when I opened it and saw a bunch of papers, I started reading them. They were all letters from my grandpapa. He was already dead by then, and my pops never talked about him, except to say what a mean man he'd been. But these letters, grandpapa just kept apologizing. He kept saying he was sorry for sending his little Lucy away to that place. And let me guess, that place was Brookline, Jordan said coldly. He obviously still wasn't convinced. It had to be, Abby replied quickly. There was stuff about how she was dangerous and how he had sent her away for her own good, and there was more. Grandpapa kept talking about making a trip to New Hampshire. He never mentioned Brookline by name, but I can see how you would put 2 and 2 together, Dan finished, trying to show at least a little support. She nodded. It all adds up. I mean, listen, I didn't think it was possible either. Part of me always assumed I was imagining it, or had completely read them wrong. After that first time my pops found out I'd read the letters and moved them. After that first time, my pops found out I'd read the letters and moved them all. But I never forgot. And when I got the letter about this program, well, I thought the fact that it was in New Hampshire was a sign. A sign of how ridiculous this story is, Jordan protested, sinking down lower in his seat. I mean, what? You just thought you'd come work on your art skills and find your long-lost aunt at the same time? Kill two birds with one stone? Abby looked horrified. Jordan, Dan warned. But Jordan barreled right on ahead, gesturing first to Dan and then to Abby. Let me guess, you guys made this up together. You thought you'd have a harmless laugh at my expense. Well, haha, very funny. It's not working, okay? I'm not that gullible. Jordan, why would I make something like this up? It's too sick. Jordan shrugged. Who knows? Attention? Fun? Take your pick. God, you're such an asshole sometimes. She clenched her jaw and looked at Jordan as if she had never really seen him before. Let's all calm down and just think for a minute, Dan said, hating to see the anger between them. First of all, Jordan, I have to ask, do you really think I wrote this note to myself for attention? Jordan sighed. I don't know anymore, man. You, Abby, I don't know what's going on. I feel like you're trying to make me look stupid. Like the two of you are ganging up on me. Okay. And Abby, do you think there's any chance this could be a different Lucy Valdez? He asked. No, she replied firmly. I know it's her, and I bet there's more evidence somewhere in the old wing about what they did to her. Jordan snorted. Suddenly, Abby slammed her fist down on the table. Both boys jumped in their seats. Dan's plate rattled, his hill of macaroni crumbling. What would it take for you to trust me? Jordan didn't say anything. I trust you, Dan said in a placating murmur. Uh-huh. Peter Malark over here believes you. In other news, rain is wet, Jordan said. Color me sir freaking prized. Taking his coffee and pie, he left without another word. The rain and the sounds of the dining hall rose up to fill the silence left by Jordan's angry departure. You all right? Dan asked. Would you be? No. No, I guess not. And there's your answer. Dan took a spoonful of her minestrone. It's cold. Oh, then there's your answer. She took a spoonful of her minestrone. Ugh, it's cold. Dan scrambled for something helpful to say. All he could think about was how, if Abby could keep such a big secret so well, there might be any number of things she still hadn't shared. Not that he was any better. You know what about Jordan? I think he's so upset about the date thing. He's probably worrying that we can't be a duo and a trio at the same time, you know? What? A duo? Abby frowned, staring off into the middle distance. Oh, right. Yeah, maybe. Maybe that's it. Dan didn't want to take her response as personally as he did, given the fight she'd just had with Jordan, but she'd really turned cold there at the mention of the word date. Everything seemed to be slipping out of control. His new best friends were quickly withdrawing from him and from each other. He had to find answers and hold the group together, or they'd be total strangers again. Then the Hydra really would be dead. Don't worry, we'll figure this whole thing out, he said. I know I will, Abby said coolly. I'm going back into that office, one way or another. So, Jordan, to me, so far in this novel, is actually the most interesting character, or rather, I guess, the most well-written character. You don't know what's going on internally with him. You have hints of his insecurities in the past, like with how his friend, when his friend found out he was gay, his friend kind of just cut him loose. And you can see throughout the novel, he only talks about it once, but you can see how he reacts to things, that's really affected him in the past. Even now, he takes things so personally. And he's kind of an asshole, but it even kind of makes sense. That kind of characterization, I feel like, is lacking from Abby and from Dan. Maybe it's just more evident with Jordan. Maybe there are some hints with Abby too. Her parents are musicians. They threaten to get a divorce. I just can't see it with Jordan or with Abby. That was really, probably, in my opinion, the best scene in this novel so far. This conversation between Dan, Abby, and Jordan, where they both share something with the group, and Jordan internalizes this. Now, I'm not sure why, and I expect that we'll find this out sooner or later. Maybe because Jordan feels left out, because Dan got a note, Abby found something about her aunt. What does Jordan have? He didn't have anything. And as ridiculous as that sounds, I can see someone who's insecure getting offended about, or letting something, even something like that, bothering them. And I do think that it's great that Abby and Dan's date is still bothering him, or seems to be bothering him, or seems to have affected his security within the group. And it's evident that right now, none of them are closer to each other than one, as in, like, Abby and Jordan aren't closer than Abby and Dan. But each of them, I guess at least Dan and Jordan, slightly feel like, Jordan feels like he's being ganged up on. Dan feels like they're all drifting apart. Abby, that last sentence, I know I will. She's kind of got this solo mindset now. I do not like their characterization as a group as a Hydra, because there's nothing built up to it. Meaning that you can call, sure, Harry Potter series is a very obvious example, but Hermione, Ron, Harry, you can call them a Hydra, because they've had all of these adventures together. Jordan, Dan, and Abby have not had any adventures together. Sure, they've had personal adventures together that no one else really knows about. But where did that nickname come from? Like, they haven't done anything to their classmates or their peers to have gotten them that nickname. That nickname alone, to me, just seems like a gimmick thrown in, where it's like, oh yeah, reader, these guys are so close that they have their own nickname, when, again, actions speak louder than words. Their peers, what have their peers seen to have given them that nickname? We've seen them have a couple incidents together, but they've only been friends like, what, a week, 2 weeks? How did they already get that nickname? And someone's writing them a secret note with that nickname. I don't like that. That nickname to me seems forced, and it seems like a very cheap method to try to communicate to the readers again, hey, they're such good friends, they're a Hydra. I don't believe that. What else? Now, we've gotten a pretty big hint that Dan is connected to the warden. When he visited Sal, Dan mentioned something when, like, Sal kicked him out after mentioning Dennis Heinlein. Dan mentioned something, or made a statement along the lines of, Why did Sal get so upset at the mention of Dennis Heinlein? Sal even wrote about Dennis in his own website. Now, this is a misdirection. Dan is making an assumption, and he's kind of leading the reader along with that assumption, which is great. I think that's good. Because if you read the text here, what did you say your name was? Sal interrupted, slamming his mug down on the island. I didn't, Dan stammered, taking a step back. It's Dan Crawford. It was like a bomb had gone off. At Dan's name, a bomb had gone off. Not at Dennis Hainline's name. At Dennis Hainline's name, that kind of triggered something. That triggered Sal to flinch and Sal's wife to look at Dan. And it triggered the next question, what is your name? Now, only at the mention of Dan's name did that figurative bomb go off. There is definitely a connection with Dennis Hainline and Dan Crawford. There have been hints dropped in the past, ever since some of the first chapters, that Dan is somehow intrinsically connected with the last warden. The first hint was when Dan, Jordan, and Abby first went to investigate the bottom, I guess, the asylum section. Dan kind of defended the warden from Abby, despite his like for Abby. I do think that Dan either is the warden or is connected somehow to the warden. Let me think. Abby is also connected to Brookline through her aunt. Now, what's Jordan's connection? Felix is questionable. Felix, if looking back in this novel, Felix is the character who really got the ball rolling with this whole investigation of Brookline. But the first or second chapter, Dan finds this photograph. And casually, Felix was like, oh, you know where else has those photographs? And he kind of very subtly directed Dan to where he could find more evidence. When Dan was having nightmares, Felix was watching him. Innocuous enough. Like, sure, if your roommate's having nightmares and like thrashing in his sleep, you're going to watch him. But still, why point that out? Like, why was that worth the text in this novel? It must have meaning. I do think that Felix is also connected to Brookline and also connected directly to Dan. Now, you can also think, in this novel, let's say writing this novel, right? You're an author, you're writing this novel. Felix has to have a purpose. Why would Dan have a roommate who doesn't do shit in the story? If Felix was not an important character, he would not exist in this novel. Dan would be in a solo dorm, right? So there's definitely something going on with Felix. I think that Felix is directly connected with Dan. I think that Dan is somehow connected to the warden. Something with Dan's name, Dan Crawford. Abby is connected to the asylum. Now, Jordan, how is Jordan connected in all of this? In this entire novel, Jordan is the most thorough character. His dialogue is great. You see a glimpse into his character and his insecurities through his dialogue. It's not like let's It's not like Jordan looked like he was so angry. It's you can see that he's mad in his dialogue, and you can see he pokes and he pokes and he pokes, and he's so defensive. You can see that insecurity in his dialogue. It is picking up. It is getting better than before. We're about right at the halfway mark. I'm hoping that we just had a kind of shitty first arc, first arc, and I hope the second act, rather, really steps it up. I'm going to end this broadcast right here. Thank you, as always, for tuning in. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you next time.